She set the table like she was staging a performance. Every fork placed with the precision of someone who needed the world to see how far she had come. The candles were lit before noon. The flowers, imported, of course, arranged in a vase that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. And at the center of it all, Eleanor Voss stood in her element, hosting the kind of Sunday dinner that was less about food and more about proof that she had won. What Eleanor did not know, what none of them knew, gathered around that gleaming table with their polished smiles and rehearsed contempt, was that the man they had invited to humiliate had spent the last 10 years becoming something none of them could have imagined. Not because he had tried to prove anything to them, but because, when you strip a man of everything he thought defined him and leave him with only his own mind, sometimes what grows back is extraordinary. His name was Daniel Marsh. And the Sunday dinner that Eleanor had orchestrated so carefully, designed to remind him of exactly where she believed he stood, would instead become the moment that changed every single life in that room. Before we go any further into this story, if you have ever been dismissed by someone who later discovered they had gravely miscalculated, this one is for you. Drop your city in the comments below. Let us know where you are watching from. And if you appreciate stories about patience, dignity, and the kind of justice that does not need to raise its voice, make sure you like this video and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let us go back to where this story truly begins. 10 years before that Sunday dinner, Daniel Marsh had sat across from his wife in a lawyer's office and signed his name on papers that felt like a verdict. He was 34 years old. He had spent 8 years building what he believed was a life, a marriage, a home in the suburbs of Denver, a small but growing architectural consulting firm that he had started from a single rented desk in a shared office space. He had believed in the architecture of everything, the way structures are built from the ground up, the way solid foundations determine everything that rises above them. He had applied this philosophy to his marriage with the same earnest devotion he applied to his work. Eleanor had other ideas about what a foundation should look like. She came from the Voss family, one of those old Denver families that had accumulated enough of a name over 2 or 3 generations to consider themselves genuine American aristocracy. Her parents, Gerald and Patricia Voss, owned a real estate development company that had expanded aggressively through the 90s and early 2000s, and they wore their success the way some people wear cologne, in quantities that announced their arrival in any room. Eleanor was their eldest daughter, and she had absorbed the family's particular brand of social measurement with what appeared to be genetic efficiency. When she had married Daniel 8 years earlier, her family had tolerated the union with the particular grace of people doing a tremendous favor. Daniel was talented, her parents had acknowledged, with the tone of someone grading a term paper. Talented, but without pedigree. His firm was small, his ambitions large, and his bank account, they had made quietly certain to note, unremarkable. He was, in the Voss family's careful taxonomy, a project. Something Eleanor was doing for love, or perhaps for the rebellious thrill of marrying slightly beneath her station, before she inevitably came to her senses. She came to her senses at year 8. The divorce was swift, and from Eleanor's perspective, deeply satisfying. She had built a case, as people who grow up in families of developers learn to do, systematically, with attention to what could be leveraged. She had documented his long hours, his distraction, his emotional unavailability, which was, in the framing of the proceedings, entirely true. Daniel had poured himself into his work during their final 2 years together because he had seen something. A window, a possibility, a particular shift in commercial real estate development that he believed he could position his firm to capitalize on. He had not communicated this well. He had not communicated much of anything well, consumed as he was by the architecture of what might be possible. Eleanor communicated it very well to her lawyer and then to a judge. Daniel walked out of that office with his personal belongings, modest settlement that reflected both the relative youth of his firm and the particular skill of the Voss family's legal team, and the quiet, bruising clarity that he was now, at 34, starting over in ways that were simultaneously terrifying and underneath the devastation. Faintly liberating, he rented a one-bedroom apartment on the unfashionable edge of Denver's lower downtown district. He kept his desk at the shared office space. He called his mother in Albuquerque and told her he was fine, in a voice that clearly indicated he was not. And then, because he had no other architecture available to him, he built. The window he had spotted was this: mid-sized commercial real estate developers were being systematically underserved by large architectural consulting firms that prioritized prestige projects, and overcharged by boutique firms that lacked the analytical infrastructure to deliver at scale. Daniel had spent 4 years quietly developing a proprietary methodology, a framework for sustainable structural analysis paired with financial modeling that could serve this exact gap in the market. It was not glamorous work. It was precise, meticulous, and enormously useful to the people who needed it. He licensed the methodology to a Denver developer at year 1 post-divorce, then to 2 firms in Chicago at year 2. He hired 3 analysts and moved out of the shared office space at year 3. By year 4, he had been approached by a venture capital group that recognized what he had built not merely as a consulting practice, but as a scalable platform, a technology and methodology business with intellectual property at its center. Daniel spent 6 months negotiating the terms of that partnership with a care that reflected everything he had learned in law offices and in marriage about reading the foundations of agreements carefully. By year 7 after the divorce, the platform, now operating under the name Stratum Analytics, had partnerships with 47 commercial real estate developers across 12 states. By year 9, a major technology company with interests in the intersection of architecture, data analytics, and urban infrastructure had expressed acquisition interest. Daniel had hired a team of advisors, including a corporate attorney named Marcus Webb, who had the particular gift of being simultaneously brilliant and unintimidating, and they had spent 18 months navigating what became one of the more quietly significant commercial transactions in the Denver business community. The acquisition closed 14 months before Eleanor's Sunday dinner. The figure was not public because Daniel had specifically negotiated confidentiality into the terms, along with certain ongoing equity arrangements and advisory compensation that continued to accumulate. The figure was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Not the kind of wealth that requires press releases, the kind that requires a different relationship with the concept of the future. Daniel was 44 years old. He lived in a converted loft in lower downtown Denver that he had renovated with the kind of restraint that reflects actual confidence rather than performed austerity. He drove a car that was reliable and 11 years old because he had not yet gotten around to addressing that particular detail, and also because he had found that the car told him things about people that he found useful. He had a standing Saturday morning commitment to a mentorship organization for first-generation college students pursuing careers in design and engineering. He had 3 people who knew the full scope of what he had built: Marcus Webb, his accountant, and his mother in Albuquerque. And he had a temperament that remained, despite everything, congenitally unsuited to performance. This was perhaps why, when Eleanor's younger sister Vivian called him in late October to extend an invitation to the Voss family's Thanksgiving adjacent Sunday dinner in November, his first instinct was to decline politely. Vivian was the sister who had always occupied a different moral territory from the rest of her family. She was 38, a pediatric occupational therapist who had spent enough time in rooms where outcomes actually mattered to develop a sober assessment of where genuine value resided. She and Daniel had maintained a careful, sporadic friendship through the years of the divorce and after, the kind that survives precisely because it asks little and offers honesty. She called him from her car, parked outside her office, because she had learned that the Voss family house was not a useful location for certain kinds of truth-telling. "I want to be transparent with you," Vivian said, "because I think you deserve that. Eleanor has been telling the family that she ran into you last month. She says you looked." Her word diminished. "She's made some comments about wanting the family to see that she made the right choices. I think she's planning something, and I think it involves you being there so she can make a point." Daniel was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Outside his loft windows, Denver's late autumn was doing its characteristic thing. The sky, a cold, flat pewter, the mountains in the distance, carrying their first serious snowfall like a pronouncement. He had been in the middle of reviewing a quarterly analysis that his investment manager had sent over, numbers that would have altered Eleanor's dinner plans considerably had she been aware of them. "She ran into me at the hardware store," Daniel said. "I was buying paint." "She mentioned the paint," Vivian said with a tone that communicated a great deal about how the paint had been discussed. Daniel considered the logical response, which was to decline. He also considered something else, a thought that arrived not from bitterness, because he had spent considerable effort ensuring that bitterness found no permanent lodging in him, but from a different place, entirely. A place that recognized that some conversations, some reckonings, have a particular moment when they are ready to happen, and that avoiding them indefinitely is its own kind of structural failure. "I'll come," he said. Vivian paused. "Are you sure? Tell me what time." The Voss family home sat in Cherry Creek, in a neighborhood where the houses were large enough to suggest significance, and similar enough to suggest that significance in this zip code moved in a fairly narrow range. It was a Sunday in mid-November, and the last of the season's leaves had finally surrendered to the cold, leaving the oak trees in the front yard looking architectural in their bare clarity. Daniel arrived at 12:45, 15 minutes before the stated time, which was either a social virtue or a minor eccentricity, depending on who was measuring. He had driven his 11-year-old car. He was wearing a charcoal wool sweater that his mother had given him 2 birthdays ago, and dark slacks that were well made and entirely unremarkable. He carried a bottle of wine. A very good bottle of wine, though without a label that announced its quality to anyone not already familiar with it, and he stood at the front door for exactly 1 breath before ringing the bell. Gerald Voss opened the door. He was 71, still broad-shouldered, still carrying himself with the proprietary confidence of a man who has been master of his environment for long enough that he has forgotten it was ever in question. He looked at Daniel with an expression that managed to be simultaneously cordial and assessing, the way one might look at a piece of furniture one is considering donating. Daniel, a handshake, firm. The kind that is meant to establish rather than welcome. "Come in." "Eleanor said you might actually show up." The way he said it, the construction of that sentence, the might actually, was a small architecture of dismissal so familiar that Daniel recognized it the way you recognize a building you once lived in, even when the paint has changed. "Gerald," Daniel said pleasantly, "thank you for having me." The house was full of exactly the people Daniel had expected. Patricia Voss, Eleanor's mother, was in the kitchen conducting what appeared to be a culinary military operation, directing the catering staff with the precision of someone who has never been fully convinced that other people can be trusted. Eleanor's brother, Whitfield, called Whit by a family that specialized in names that required explanation, was in the living room with his wife, Courtney, both of them constructed and glossy, in the way of people who have made lifestyle their primary project. There were cousins. There was Gerald's business partner, a man named Arden Forsyth, who was approximately Gerald's age and approximately Gerald's disposition, present presumably as an audience for whatever was planned. And there was Eleanor. She was standing near the fireplace when Daniel came through from the entrance hallway, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed her face that was too quick to classify before the performance reasserted itself. She was 42, and she wore it with the particular determination of a woman who has decided that attractiveness is an argument to be won rather than a quality to be inhabited. She was in a burgundy dress that was expensive and knew it, and when she smiled at Daniel, it was the smile of someone who has already decided the outcome of the conversation they are about to have. "Daniel," she crossed the room. A kiss on each cheek, the affectation she had adopted after a business trip to Paris 7 years ago, which Daniel knew because Vivian had mentioned it. "You came." "I did," Daniel said. "You look well, Eleanor." "I am well," she said, and then, tilting her head with an expression of exquisitely calibrated sympathy. "How are you doing?" Vivian mentioned, "You're still at that little office in lower downtown." "Are you still?" She made a vague gesture with her hand that was meant to indicate the whole modest, unremarkable shape of his life. "Consulting? I stay busy," Daniel said. She patted his arm. "That's wonderful. It really is." Keeping busy is so important. From across the room, Vivian caught Daniel's eye. She had the expression of someone watching a controlled experiment and wondering whether the protocols will hold. Dinner was served at 1:30. Around a table that seated 14 and was currently occupied by 12, and the architecture of the seating arrangement was deliberate in ways that Daniel noted with professional appreciation. He had been placed at the far end from the head between Arden Forsyth, who clearly knew very little about Daniel and had been briefed in broad, unflattering strokes, and a cousin of Eleanor's named Madison, who was 26 and primarily interested in discussing a podcast she was launching about sustainable luxury living. A phrase she appeared to find non-contradictory. Eleanor was at the table's center, positioned precisely where she could conduct the conversation and observe its effects simultaneously. Gerald anchored one end. Patricia had finally emerged from the kitchen to anchor the other. The meal was excellent. The conversation around it was constructed to be less so. It began subtly. Gerald asked Daniel what he was up to these days, in the tone of a man asking after a minor acquaintance, and when Daniel offered his standard, measured, non-answer, that he had been focused on some interesting analytical work, that things had developed in some good directions. Gerald nodded with the patience of a man who has heard many young people describe modest things as interesting. Arden Forsyth made a remark about the commercial real estate market being brutal for small operators. Right now, his eyes cutting briefly to Daniel, and then immediately began a conversation with Gerald about their own development projects. A current downtown mixed-use development that they described with the particular expansiveness of men narrating their own legend. Whit, from across the table, asked Daniel whether he was still driving the same car he'd had forever. Daniel confirmed that he was. Whit exchanged a glance with Courtney that traveled the distance between them like a signal. Then Eleanor, setting down her wine glass with the precise timing of someone who has been waiting for her moment, looked down the table at Daniel with an expression that managed to assemble warmth and condescension into a single architectural marvel, and said, "I have to ask." "Daniel, and I ask because I genuinely care. Do you ever regret not being more ambitious back when you had the opportunity?" "I think about it sometimes. How differently things might have gone if you'd been willing to take bigger swings." The table found a particular quality of quiet. She was not finished. "I don't mean that cruelly. I really don't. I see what drive looks like." A gesture toward her father. Toward Arden Forsyth. A small, rueful expression turned toward Daniel, as if she were sorry on his behalf for what he had failed to become. "And I wonder sometimes if you were always just comfortable, too comfortable, whether that was the real issue." Daniel set down his own glass. He looked at Eleanor for a moment with an expression that was entirely unreadable, which was itself a kind of answer to people trained to read expressions for evidence of damage. "It's an interesting question," he said. "I've thought about ambition a lot over the years." "I'm sure," Eleanor said, with a warmth that was its own category of cruelty, The thing that I kept coming back to, Daniel continued, his voice carrying exactly the same pleasant, conversational register it had maintained since he walked through the door, is the difference between ambition that's pointed outward toward what other people can see and ambition that's pointed at a problem. The first kind needs an audience. The second kind just needs the problem. He picked up his glass again. I found a problem I was interested in. It kept me busy for a while. That's a very philosophical way to describe, Eleanor started. It is, Daniel agreed pleasantly, and he let the sentence end there. Vivian, 2 seats away from Eleanor, was looking at her wineglass with the focused attention of someone who is working very hard to keep her expression neutral. The dinner resumed. The conversation moved around Daniel, the way water moves around a stone. He was acknowledged when useful for contrast, and otherwise treated as confirmation of a thesis the table had already accepted. Arden Forsyth told a story about a development deal that had netted his partnership a figure he specified, with the delight of a man who has discovered that numbers can be used as weaponry. Gerald discussed a planned expansion that would bring the Voss development portfolio to a value that he mentioned twice, once for Gerald and once, apparently, for everyone else. Eleanor laughed at the right moments and presided over the table with the authority of a woman who has arranged things exactly as she intended. Daniel ate his dinner. He asked Madison polite questions about her podcast. He complimented Patricia on the roasted root vegetables, which were genuinely excellent. He watched the room with the patient, structural attention of someone who spent his life understanding how systems were built, what held them up, and where, if you looked carefully, the load-bearing assumptions were located. The moment that changed the afternoon arrived without theatrical announcement, the way most genuinely significant moments do. It arrived in the form of Daniel's phone, which he had set to silent but not to dark, vibrating against the table with a message from Marcus Webb. Daniel glanced at it as naturally as one does when a phone lights up, intending to set it face down again, but the message was flagged urgent, Marcus's single reliable deployment of that designation. And so, Daniel read 3 words of the preview text before turning the screen over. Across the table, Arden Forsyth, who had the peripheral attentiveness of a man who has conducted many negotiations by watching what other people's screens said, saw nothing useful, but he had seen Daniel look. And for reasons of pure social dominance maintenance, he said, "Important call from the office." "What office is it that you're working out of now, Daniel?" It was a nothing question, a footnote to a sentence already in progress. Except that Eleanor looked up from her conversation and Gerald looked up from his and the table. That table of 12 people assembled partly as an audience found itself briefly aligned in the direction of the answer. Daniel looked at Arden Forsyth with the equanimity of a man who has had a very long time to decide what kind of person he intends to be in moments that offer him a choice. "I'm not working out of an office at the moment," Daniel said. "I completed a transaction about 14 months ago. I've been managing some ongoing advisory commitments from home, mostly." "Transaction?" Gerald said, his voice carrying the particular quality of a developer whose interest has been activated against his intentions. "My company was acquired," Daniel said. "Stratum Analytics. Perhaps you've come across the name." He watched with quiet attention as Gerald and Arden processed the name. He watched the moment of non-recognition, and then something different, because people who live in certain commercial real estate circles had, in the past 2 years, encountered the name Stratum Analytics in a specific context. In the context of the technology acquisition story that had circulated quietly in the trade publications. In the context of the proprietary methodology that had reshaped how a significant portion of mid-market commercial development was being analyzed and underwritten. In the context of a transaction figure that had not been published but had been discussed with varying degrees of accuracy by people who made it their business to know such things. Gerald's expression moved through several stages. The way a building goes through phases, there was the original structure of his certainty, And then there was something being recalculated, and then there was the particular quality of stillness that precedes a fundamental reassessment. Stratum Analytics, Arden Forsyth said slowly. The structural analytics platform. That's right, Daniel said. You built that. It was not quite a question. I did. Daniel paused. Started it about a year after the divorce, actually. It grew in some directions I didn't entirely anticipate. The table was very still. Eleanor had stopped moving. She had been in the middle of reaching for the bread, and her hand had simply paused in the air at that particular distance from the basket. Not quite there. Not quite retreated, as if the central command system had received information that required a temporary suspension of all non-essential operations. What was the? Whit started from across the table and then stopped, because he was not entirely certain how to finish the question without revealing the specific nature of his interest in the answer. The terms were confidential, Daniel said pleasantly. I can say that the outcome was very good. I'm fortunate. He said it the way he said most things, simply, without architecture designed for effect, which was precisely why it landed the way it did. Vivian looked up from her wine glass. She met Daniel's eyes briefly, and in that exchange, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, a great deal was communicated. She had known. She had known because she was the kind of person Daniel trusted, and because she had asked him a direct question 3 years ago, and he had answered it honestly, and she had kept that answer as carefully as she kept everything that mattered to her. What was communicated in those 2 seconds was not triumph. It was recognition. It was two people who had managed, across the wreckage of a family's assumptions, to maintain something real. Eleanor found her voice. It arrived slightly altered in register, higher by a fraction, the modulation that occurs when a performance must be recalibrated mid-stage. Daniel, that's wonderful. I didn't realize. She stopped. She was experiencing something specific. The vertigo of a person who has built an entire social architecture on a foundation that has just revealed itself to be a different material than expected. All of her careful arrangement, the seating, the questions, the measured sympathies deployed across the dinner table was showing her its underside now. Every pointed remark about ambition, every implication of comfortable mediocrity, every performance of generous concern for a man she had dismissed. These things were still in the room. They had not gone anywhere. They were sitting at the table with everyone else, occupying their assigned seats. You didn't realize because I didn't mention it, Daniel said without unkindness. I don't tend to lead with it. It's not what I find most interesting about my days. What do you find most interesting? Madison asked, with the genuine curiosity of someone who had not been briefed on the preferred narrative. Daniel considered this. Honestly, the mentorship work, I do. There's an organization I work with on Saturday mornings, first-generation students, going into design and engineering. Watching someone figure out that the thing they're good at is actually a thing the world needs is. He stopped, a small, private smile. That's harder to walk away from than most things I've done professionally. The table had not recovered its previous rhythm. Gerald was silent in the particular way of a man whose internal model of a situation has been significantly revised and who requires time to generate a new one. Arden Forsyth was studying Daniel with the frank, calculating attention of a developer who has just recognized that the person across the table is in a different category than the one he had assigned him to at the beginning of lunch. Courtney had stopped performing her expensive boredom and was looking at her husband's face. Whit's face was the specific color of a man who had asked about the 11-year-old car. Eleanor cleared her throat. Well, she said, reaching the word through what appeared to be genuine effort. We should have. I wish I had known. We should have. I would have. You would have arranged things differently, Daniel said quietly. Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact offered with the gentleness of someone who knows the difference between punishment and clarity. Eleanor looked at him. For perhaps the first time in the afternoon, the performance dropped just enough. Something passed across her face. Not quite shame. Not yet, but its precursor. The awareness that she had been, for approximately 90 minutes, engaged in an elaborate exercise in condescension directed at a man who had spent the intervening decade building something that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the story she had been telling about him. "Daniel," she said, and then found she had nothing to follow it with. "I had a really good meal," Daniel said, addressing the table generally with the warmth of someone who means it. "Patricia, those root vegetables, genuinely excellent." "The thyme in there, rosemary and thyme both," Patricia said, slightly dazed. "It's a barefoot Contessa technique." "It works," Daniel said sincerely. He stayed another 40 minutes. He was gracious. He was pleasant. He helped carry dishes to the kitchen when the meal concluded, because that was what he would have done, regardless of what anyone at the table knew or didn't know about him. And because grace is not a performance you turn on for an audience. It is either the material you are made of, or it is not. Gerald attempted twice to redirect the conversation toward Voss development, toward the downtown mixed-use project, toward the notion that there might be interesting synergies worth discussing, with the barely navigated eagerness of a man who has just recategorized a dismissal as an opportunity. Daniel listened attentively. He was non-committal in the specific way of someone who has learned what good terms look like and can take his time. Arden Forsyth shook his hand at the door with a different quality of handshake than the one Gerald had offered on arrival. Daniel noticed this. He did not remark upon it. Vivian walked him to his car. The afternoon had gone gray and cold, the kind of Colorado November cold that arrives with the seriousness of a finality, and their breath came out in small clouds as they stood on the sidewalk beside the 11-year-old car that Whit had asked about at dinner. "You knew," Daniel said. "It was not an accusation." "I knew she was planning something unpleasant," Vivian said. "I didn't know whether you'd come. You called me." "I called you because you deserved to make the choice with accurate information." She looked at him steadily. "That's all I can ever give anyone." Daniel nodded. He looked back at the house for a moment. Its careful, performed elegance, its optimized hedges, its windows lit against the late afternoon like a stage set. He thought about what it means to build things. The difference between building for an audience and building because the problem calls for it. The difference between a structure designed to impress and one designed to last. "Does it feel like what you thought it would?" Vivian asked. All of it. Daniel thought about the question. He thought about the one-bedroom apartment on the unfashionable edge of downtown, and the rented desk, and the calls to his mother in a voice that indicated things he could not say directly. He thought about 6 years of work so immersive that time had reorganized itself around the problem rather than around his comfort. He thought about Marcus Webb reading a final term sheet across a conference table at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, and looking up with the expression of someone who has just confirmed that the arithmetic is correct. "Most of it," he said. "The work part, yes. The other part." He stopped. "You can't make something that happened not have happened. You can only decide what you build afterward." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "She's going to call you," she said, finally. "Probably by Tuesday. Eleanor, she's going to have thought about it, and she's going to call. What should I say?" "Whatever you actually think," Vivian said, which was the answer Daniel had expected, because Vivian's fundamental position on most questions was always the same. Eleanor called on Monday, not Tuesday, Monday, which perhaps said something about the specific velocity of her recalibration. Daniel let it go to voicemail, not because he was avoiding the conversation, but because he was finishing a call with his investment manager that seemed more appropriately urgent. He called her back at 6 that evening. Her voice was different. The performance architecture had been taken apart, and the voice underneath it, the one that perhaps existed before a family's expectations had been layered over it year by year, like accumulated coats of paint, was thinner and more uncertain than Daniel had heard in a long time. "I owe you an apology," she said. Not immediately, because it took a few minutes of managed small talk to reach it, but she reached it. Yesterday, the things I said about ambition, She stopped, started again. I had built a version of you in my head, for years, because it was easier than some of the other things I would have had to think about if I hadn't. Daniel listened. I told myself that the marriage failed because you weren't enough, Eleanor continued, the words arriving with the particular effort of someone dismantling something they constructed specifically to bear weight. That I had outgrown it, that I had made a wise decision. And then I saw you at the hardware store, and I told myself, I could see that you were small, that you were where I had always expected you to stay. A pause. I think I needed that. I think I needed to keep you small. I know, Daniel said. That's a terrible thing to realize about yourself. It is, he agreed without comfort or additional cruelty, but realizing it is different from not realizing it. Silence on the line. Outside Daniel's loft, Denver was doing its evening thing. The lights of the downtown buildings coming up, the mountains invisible in the dark, but present in the way that permanent things are present even when you cannot see them. I don't know what I was hoping to hear, Eleanor said. I don't think I'm the person who can give you whatever it is, Daniel said, but I think you already know what you need to do with what you know about yourself. That's not mine to manage. She said she understood. He believed she meant it. They said goodbye, without warmth and without malice, which was perhaps the most honest version of their relationship that had ever existed, and Daniel sat in the quiet of his loft for a while afterward, watching the city lights and thinking about the architecture of regret, how it is built from the same materials as integrity, the same choices, just assembled in a different configuration, and how there is almost always a point where the difference could have gone either way. The weeks that followed were in their way more interesting than the dinner itself. Gerald Voss called Marcus Webb's office, which was how Daniel had arranged for certain categories of contact to be handled, and made inquiries about the advisory arrangements Daniel had mentioned in non-committal terms at the table. Marcus had the useful quality of being simultaneously warm and unmoved, and he communicated to Gerald with perfect pleasantness that Daniel's advisory schedule was currently full and that he would note Gerald's interest for possible future consideration. Gerald called back twice. Marcus noted his interest with continued pleasantness. Arden Forsyth was more indirect. He had a contact who knew someone who had worked with Stratum Analytics before the acquisition, and through this chain of professional adjacency, he caused it to be communicated to Daniel that he was a great admirer of the methodology, had always found the work exceptional, and would welcome the opportunity for a conversation when Daniel's schedule allowed. Daniel's schedule allowed, in the fullness of time and on terms that Marcus helped structure, which is a story of a different kind. Witt sent a LinkedIn connection request. Daniel accepted it because it cost nothing and said nothing, and because he had been raised to believe that small courtesies are their own reward. The response that stayed with Daniel the longest came not from any member of the Voss family, but from Madison, the 26-year-old cousin, with the Sustainable Luxury podcast. She sent him a message through Instagram, which was itself a kind of information about how she navigated the world, asking whether he would be willing to come on the podcast to talk about building something from nothing. She wrote that she had been thinking about the conversation at dinner, about what he had said about ambition being pointed at a problem rather than an audience, and that she thought her listeners needed to hear that framing. He said yes. They recorded the episode in January, in his loft, and Madison turned out to be considerably sharper than the dinner table had suggested, which he should have anticipated, because dinner tables often do that. They flatten people into the shape that other people need them to occupy. The episode generated the most listener response of anything she had produced. She sent him a note that said simply, they needed to hear that someone did it quietly. He thought about that phrase for a long time. The idea that quiet building is its own kind of message, that the absence of performance is sometimes the most important information a person can transmit. He thought about the 34-year-old man who had signed those papers in that office and driven back to a one-bedroom apartment with the weight of it and how that man could not have known what the next 10 years contained. How the thing that felt like a demolition was actually as demolitions sometimes are, when you have the right understanding of structures, preparation, clearing the ground for what the problem actually called for. He was 44 years old. He had built something real. He had not required anyone to see it, to know that it was real. And on a Sunday afternoon in November, in a house arranged specifically to contain him in a particular shape, he had simply been himself, the same self he had been in the one-bedroom apartment, the same self he had been at the rented desk, the same self he had brought to every iteration of the work, and that self had turned out to be more than enough. More than enough is not a triumphant phrase. It does not rise to crescendo. It does not arrange itself for an audience. It sits in the room with you on a quiet evening, and it is simply, completely the truth. So here's what this story leaves us with, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before we go. The people who dismiss you are not seeing you. They are seeing the story they need to tell about you to make their own story work. That story is about them, not about you. Your job, the only real job, is to know the difference. To keep building what the problem calls for, with or without an audience. To maintain the dignity that no circumstance can remove unless you hand it over. And to be the kind of person who, when the reckoning comes, does not need to say, "I told you so," because the work has already said it, in a language that cannot be disputed. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who later had to revise their opinion of you? Or perhaps you are in the middle of your own quiet building right now, and the people around you have not yet seen what you are making. I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell us your story. Tell us where you are watching from. This community is built on exactly the kind of honesty that dinner tables often refuse to allow. And that is exactly why it matters. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like. It helps more people find their way here when they need this kind of reminder. Subscribe so you are here for the next one. And keep building. Quietly, if necessary. Patiently, always. The foundation you are laying right now is telling the whole story, even when no one is watching.